Welcome to Unlocking Your Truth, another podcast by Dr. Leslie Phillips.
Welcome, listeners. You are tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie. And if you are new to Unlocking Your Truth, let me explain. This is a talk show about metaphysics and spirituality. And we are broadcasting on 101.7 FM across the Fraser Valley in BC from the unceded territory of the Stolo Nation. Every week on Unlocking Your Truth, we aim to bring you information that will inspire you and that will help stretch your awareness and your imagination. And this week is no exception to that. We actually have a fabulous guest on the show, and I am going to welcome him in a moment, but I am just going to take a moment to introduce him. His name is David Young, and he is the author of several books. One of the ones that we're going to talk to him about today, though, is called The True Story of Jesus and His Wife, Mary Magdalene. And David says that mastership is not only for ascended masters. Each and every single one of us has the potential to become an ascended master ourselves. And he has, over the years, facilitated thousands of people to have very powerful spiritual experiences at his Portal Between Heaven and Earth meditation events, where he shared profound information that came to the 10 channelers found in his latest book, which I just mentioned, The True Story of Jesus and His Wife, Mary Magdalene. David, as well as being a meditation teacher and a writer, is also an artist and a musician, and is pretty well known for his music. The music that he creates is healing, therapeutic music, and he's perfected a method of playing 2 different size recorders simultaneously, and that creates a sound that people have said is the most beautiful music on earth. And it propels the participants in his workshops to have profound spiritual experiences, including out-of-body experiences. And so I could go on. There's a lot to say about you, David, but maybe I'll just pause there and say welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
It's a delight to have you. And now, so I understand that you're a musician and you've been on this journey, which has included your own spiritual awakening and your own experiences with ascended masters such as Jesus, Buddha, Saint Germain, Mother Mary, Kuan Yin, and others. So maybe we could start by perhaps if you share a little bit about your journey and your background. Who you are today and where you started and how it all unfolded for you.
Okay, well, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, before Brooklyn was cool. It's very cool now. And I learned to play the recorder in 3rd grade like everybody else. I was the worst in my class the first year, but our class got a 2nd year of the recorder, and during that 2nd year, I got proficient at it. Then I studied from a guy from the New York Philharmonic named Phil Levin, who took me under his wing, and I studied Baroque and Renaissance music. And then I got into playing guitar in high school and college and played in rock bands, and one thing led to another, and I started playing spiritual music with my flutes in the early 1990s while I was living in California.
Were you composing the spiritual music, or?
Well, spiritual music, or sometimes it's called New Age music or healing music. A lot of times that's not necessarily composed. It's more improvised than composed. Like, I don't
channeled.
know. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess channeled is like a fancy spiritual word for improvise, but you're really just going with the flow of the music.
You're in your
And,
creative flow in the moment.
and I was playing with a woman who played the Celtic harp, and we made these tapes called Celestial Winds. We sold 10,000 copies of that tape at Venice Beach between 1990 and 1992. And then we started playing at art festivals all over the country. And we worked together for a couple more years, sold 100,000 CDs together. And then I started doing the CDs on my own without really having a partner, just hiring different musicians to play with me.
Right.
And then in 2014, after I'd sold 1 million CDs, I had 2 Grammy nominations. I started doing meditation events, and people consistently were sharing that when the meditation was over, people shared that they had a conversation or spiritual travel with their mom, their dad, a friend from childhood who died young, and I didn't even know that was possible. I had been meditating.
Right. So they were. So you yourself weren't having those experiences yet, but people who came to your events were.
Oh yeah,
right?
it was consistent. It was usually half the audience was
cool.
having an experience like that, and it was weird for me at first because I had been meditating for 30 years at that point, but I had never had one of those interdimensional experiences.
Right.
And it was very bizarre to hear people share this because these people looked like total normal people. And after 6 months, about 500 people had shared those experiences. So at that point, it was normal to me because I heard this 5, 10, 20 times every night. And I did these events called A Portal Between Heaven and Earth 3 or 4 nights a week. So after 6 months, something really weird happened. And that was there were 3 people in the audience who all saw Jesus standing in the same spot in the room. And growing up in a Jewish family, I never expected that to happen ever,
Yeah.
And so that's really where it started. And then the next week, Jesus and Mother Mary and Mary Magdalene showed up, and they consistently showed up to people ever since. And at this point, over 1,400 people at my events have shared their experience with Jesus, his wife, Mary Magdalene, or Mother Mary. Another 1,000 people on top of that had experiences with Buddha, Krishna, Saint Germain, Kuan Yin, Isis, Archangel Michael, one of the other archangels, and another 5,000 people on top of that shared their experience with one of their loved ones. So this all became a normal thing. And when Jesus started showing up, apparently he told all of his friends, Buddha and Krishna and Moses and the rest of the gang, the heavenly team. And so they all started showing up at my events. And after a while, it became normal.
So, good question. I mean, the question is around, how is this happening? But to me, it sounds like your music is helping raise people's vibration and helping people enter an altered state of consciousness. Because, of course, all of those amazing beings are available to us all the time, aren't they? We just don't perceive them. So is that your understanding of what's happening, that your music is helping people enter into a trance state, raise their vibrational frequency so they can tune into things that they otherwise might not?
Yeah, exactly. And I create a very safe, comfortable, and violent environment for people. And I also tell them a bunch of incredible stories that other people who have experienced my events that they've shared. Like, for example, there was a woman who came to an event in Syracuse, New York on a Friday night. And when the meditation was over, she shared in front of the entire audience, which was 40 people. She shared that Martin Luther King showed up to her and told her that he had work for her to do in 2 to 3 days. That was on a Friday night. Well, 2.5 days later on Monday morning, she posted on my Facebook page that her boss called her into his office on Monday morning and put her in charge of the Martin Luther King Fund at their company. And she didn't know there was a Martin Luther King Fund at their company.
That's
so you know what that's
amazing. Yeah,
you know what that's called? Normal.
Mm-hmm.
Normal. That stuff happens every night at my events. Sometimes when Jesus shows up to somebody or Mother Mary shows up to somebody, it's a very serious thing. Like it could be a healing or to resolve something with a family member who's now died in heavenly dimension and is in that other dimension. But sometimes they're really funny. I need to close the window just for a minute because there's something loud happening outside. So just hold on a sec. Okay. So one of the funniest things that ever happened
go ahead.
Yeah, one of the funniest things that ever happened at my events happened a few months ago, where this woman shared that this man with this really hairy chest showed up in her meditation while I was playing the flute. And she said, "Who are you?" And he said, "I'm Jesus." And she said, "Well, why do you have such a hairy chest?" And he said, "Because I know you really like men with hairy chests." That's not a joke. That's a real story. That's the funniest thing I think that I ever heard at any of my events, you know?
That's hilarious. So all of these experiences started happening to your audience. How about you? Do you consistently have experiences of communicating with these beings now? And if so, when did it first start for you?
Well, that's a good question. Well, I didn't have these experiences at first for a long time. And it was really bizarre at first to hear people sharing these experiences because I didn't know that was possible. Wow. And I also thought that being skeptical showed people I was intelligent. You know, and eventually what happens is that the universe sets up enough spiritual synchronicities in your life where it outweighs your logical mind and your resistance and your skepticism, because, man, if you have these experiences every day for a couple of years, at a certain point, it's like, well, this is so consistent.
Yeah,
I have to believe in it. It's not intelligent if I'm skeptical of it, because look at all these things, they keep connecting, or they're all connected to the same spiritual being, you know? And I'm happy to say that after I started doing those events in 2014 and I started meditating seriously in 1983, I'm very happy to say that in the last couple of months, my channeling has really, really gotten on a much higher level than it ever was. So you're going to ask me what helped me make that breakthrough to this other level?
Well, I wasn't, but now that you suggest that I do, what helped you make that breakthrough to the other level?
Well, I think that once my book was finished, it went up one level, because I didn't really look at this book, The True Story of Jesus and His Wife, Mary Magdalene, as a risky thing for me to do. Because the way things are in America, it's like there's two worlds existing at the same time, two realities existing. Yeah. You have like the Christian approach to life, and then you have the more spiritual, open-minded, you know, way of life, you know, that involves meditation and this, you know. And the way it works now is that my events are really only advertised inside spiritual communities, because most people who are Christian won't ever go into a metaphysical bookstore or a yoga studio, you know. And likewise, most people who are into meditation and spirituality won't ever walk into a church, because there's no reason for them to go into a church anymore, you know. So in the same way that Fox News and CNN exist in the same world, and even though when you watch one of them, it's the exact opposite of the other one, those two worlds exist in this reality, and people have a choice for it. Right. So I wasn't really concerned about resistance from Christian people who were inside the box and hardcore fundamentalists. I wasn't concerned about them, because those people never come to my events anyway, you know, because the places that host my events only advertise to the people on their list who come to their places, which are people who aren't interested in going to a more fundamentalist church.
Right.
And
So we were talking about how you went to the next level in terms of channeling yourself.
so after I finished the book, I
Yeah.
felt I had gotten an upgrade,
Right.
like spiritually,
You
because
graduated.
Yeah.
That information had come through, and yes, I understand that.
and in the last 2 weeks, we finished the screenplay of turning the book into a Hollywood film. And so when we finished the screenplay, after working on the screenplay for 8 months, I felt like I had gotten another upgrade, you know.
Yeah.
I have to tell you that there's two different parts of mastership that I don't think most people realize. I didn't realize this, but ordinarily when we think of a spiritual master, we think of somebody who meditates a lot, which is important, and having a higher level of awareness of spiritual things.
Yeah.
But another aspect of mastership that is so important is, what are you doing to bring these things that you've learned spiritually to other people? Because let's say you have some guy who's in India who's meditating in a cave his whole life and doesn't ever come out of the cave. Well, what's the point in him getting much more of an upgrade if he's really going to only use that energy for himself in the cave? But,
Yeah.
but
One
when
might say he's also anchoring that that light into the world. But I agree with you.
well,
Yeah.
this isn't. This is something that I've experienced and learned with time, that the more spirituality I share with people and the more I go out there in the world to share this stuff, I find I get the energy upgrades and the different initiations of mastership,
Right.
because I'm using it
Exactly.
to share with other people. And you know, the powers that be, the heavenly beings, you know, they're looking for people to share spiritual information in a universal way that everybody can understand. But they want people to understand that there is more to life than what we were told when we were kids.
Yeah.
And the more we share this spiritual information in a common sense, down to earth way, the more accessible and more other people can benefit from it, which is what they're trying to do.
Mm-hmm. And you're right. You know, there's only so much there's only so much expansion that can happen alone in a cave. And it's you can be a master alone in a cave, but it is a completely different paradigm if you start walking around the streets and interacting with other people. You know, then that's a whole different energy dynamic, isn't it? And a different level of mastery and expansion. We're going to break now just for some advertisements. Listeners, you've been listening to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie, and this evening's guest, David Young. And David is quite a multidimensional person in that he is an artist, he is a musician, he is a channeler, he is a writer, he is a speaker, and he's been sharing some of the amazing experiences that take place at his workshops and events. We'll be back after these few short messages. Welcome back, listeners. You are tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie. And I'm having a delightful conversation with my guest this evening, whose name is David Young. And one of the most intriguing things that I want to talk to David about, because he's so multidimensional, he's a musician, he's an artist, and he's also a writer, is his book that's all about the life of Jesus. It's called The True Story of Jesus and His Wife, Mary Magdalene. Now, before the break, we were kind of setting the groundwork in how David came to write a book like this, through doing his musical events, through people having awakenings and out-of-body experiences and connections and communications with ascended masters, which eventually led to his own spiritual awakening, and then now the book. And am I to understand, David, that in this book, a lot of the information, it came through other people as opposed to coming through you, people that you knew? Is that right?
Oh, well, so much of it came through other people because
Yes.
My logical, skeptical mind was getting in the way of those messages coming through. So even though I was good at the music and the paintings and the teaching this stuff, I just didn't get messages the way channelers get messages, you know.
Yeah.
And so my ex-girlfriend, Mimi, she was an amazing channeler. And so she used to get messages from Jesus or Mother Mary or one of the other ascended masters to give to me. And it was amazing because they were always on, right on. Even when it didn't seem logical, the message I was getting. Like Jesus gave Mimi a message to give to me. He said, tell David there's big news coming out of the Vatican in Rome. And I'm like, are you kidding me? I grew up Jewish. I never cared what came out of the Vatican in Rome. And the following week, the new Pope made a statement that went against the Bible and pissed off everybody at the Vatican. And the new Pope said, there is no hell up there, pointing up to the sky. Said, the only hell there is down here on earth.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and Jesus told me that there was big news coming out of the Vatican a week before.
Yeah. Is that the current Pope that you're talking about?
Yeah, this was about 3 years ago. It was either in 2016 or 17, around there.
Yeah, I'm not a Catholic, but you know, I believe he's a pretty good guy. I think he's the reincarnation of St. Francis of Assisi, actually.
It could be. One of the things that Jesus told me through Mimi was that and this was kind of bizarre, but he said that we should pray for this Pope because he's really trying to do things that are of a higher nature than what the church normally does. And because he's trying to do things that are of a higher nature, there's a lot of resistance inside the Vatican for what he wants to do.
Yeah. So through these channeled messages, now unfortunately I haven't read your book. I would like to read your book, as it sounds amazing. But I mean, through these channeled messages, what I understand is that this whole other landscape of Jesus's life and what really happened came through. Is that right?
Absolutely. So let's take this from the beginning.
Okay.
Do you know why the missing years of his life start when he's 12 years old?
I believe that he trained in some of the mystery schools in Egypt. And he learned from spiritual masters in Egypt, from India, and from Persia. That's what my information would say.
Yeah, that's correct. But when he went to those places, that's later in his life. The reason why the missing years of his life start when he's 12 years old is because obviously he was Jewish. His real name was Yeshua. And because he was Jewish, and when you're 13, you have your bar mitzvah, but you start studying your bar mitzvah when you're 12. That's when the last crucial time, you know, because a lot of growing up Jewish, we started Hebrew school when we were 10 years old, right? But when we're 12, that's when you start learning your Torah, which is the big, gigantic thing for your bar mitzvah, which you study for about a year. And that's why the missing years of his life start when he was 12, because that's when he started studying for his bar mitzvah. And they didn't want to have his Jewish heritage in the Bible any more than they needed to have it. And so they started the missing years of his life when he was 12. And then when he was a teenager, he began to travel. And he did study from the mystery schools in Egypt, which were relatively close to Israel because Israel and Egypt are right next to each other with the Red Middle. And then after studying there for a while, then he was a sailor and he sailed to India. And he studied from the gurus and yogis over there who taught him meditation, healing, magic, all of energy healing, all of these things that they had been doing in India for 5,000 years. And when he came back to Israel when he was 30 years old, he knew how to do all the basic stuff of meditation and healing and all that good stuff.
Yeah.
And because there wasn't anybody in his community that had ever been to any of those places to learn those healing therapies and the different things that he had learned. So when he was sharing this stuff, and he had learned to heal people through energy healing and through basic chiropractic principles, you know, when he was healing people, people were all flipped out that he was healing people, but he was doing all the stuff that all the yogis and gurus know how to do in India. It's just he was the only guy on his street who knew how to do that. When he came back to Israel, and Mother Mary introduced him to Mary Magdalene at a wedding. Now, Mary Magdalene's mother had died young, and because of that, Mother Mary had become like an adopted mom to Mary Magdalene, and eventually Mary Magdalene grew up and became a woman, and when Jesus came back, they met, and they were both on a very high level of unfoldment. And Mary Magdalene had come from the wealthiest family in that whole area, and because she came from such a wealthy family, she was able to do things that most people were not able to do. She was able to travel to Egypt, to the mystery schools of Egypt, and learn from the same places that Jesus learned, except at a different time. And incredibly enough, she also was able to travel to India and study from the gurus and the yogis over there at a different time that Jesus was there. But when they met, can you imagine having that in common 2,000 years ago, that they had both been, well, Egypt isn't that far from Israel, but the fact that she had been to India, you know, that's pretty far. And one of the things that he explained to me through Mimi was that they were able to communicate telepathically, he and Mary Magdalene, because they were on a high, amazing, you know, wavelength.
Right.
They were able to communicate telepathically, and they had so much in common. Okay. Now, in the Bible, the last place that Jesus is seen is in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea.
Right.
And in the Bible, the last person who sees him is Mary Magdalene. That is because Mary Magdalene's father was Joseph of Arimathea. That's why Jesus was put in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, because that belonged to his father-in-law. Now, everybody knows that he was Jewish. His real name was Yeshua, but most people don't realize that there are 5 places in the Bible that he is called rabbi. That is because there's a prerequisite to becoming a rabbi, which is you had to have a wife and you had to have children.
Totally.
And so he was a rabbi, and Mary Magdalene was his wife. Yep. She came from the wealthiest family in that whole area, and her father was Joseph of Arimathea, who was a successful merchant who had houses and, you know, land and property everywhere. You know, back in those days, most people didn't even have a shovel, and Joseph of Arimathea had his own tomb.
Yeah. No, I mean, he founded Glastonbury Cathedral, I think, in the UK. And there's lots of legends about Jesus and Mary Magdalene visiting Glastonbury as well.
Well, I don't know if Jesus and Mary Magdalene ever made it to Glastonbury. I think Jesus made it to Glastonbury before he met Mary Magdalene. So sometime he was in his 20s.
Yeah.
Okay. He was a sailor because he loved to sail. I know he didn't go to Glastonbury after he met Mary Magdalene, because he was with Mary Magdalene for 3 years, from the time he was 30 to 33 years old. After the crucifixion, there was a Roman soldier who took him down from the cross after 6 hours. And this Roman soldier was friends with Mary Magdalene. He facilitated putting Jesus's body in that tomb while he was in a coma, having a near-death experience. And he let Mary Magdalene and her sister Martha into the tomb each day to change the bandages on his hands and on his feet and on his rib. And on the 3rd day, this Roman soldier brought a wooden cart that was covered by hay, and the cart was pulled by a horse. The Roman soldier took Jesus's body out of the tomb while he's in a coma and put his body in the center of the cart. He covered his body with hay. Mary Magdalene rode the horse, and that is how they escaped. Okay. Now, when I told that story at Unity of Sedona, this woman raised her hand and said, I'm the office manager here at Unity of Sedona. We have a monthly Mary Magdalene channeling group that we channel Mary Magdalene once a month. Mary Magdalene gave all 15 women in our group the same exact story about the wooden cart, the hay, the Roman soldier, and the horse. And that story is not in any book.
No. I trained in a modern mystery school, and the information that we had was also that Jesus survived after the crucifixion, not that that was the end of it.
So, it wasn't the end of it at all.
No.
He lived to be 72 years old. Mary Magdalene lived to be in her 50s. They had 3 children at that point when that terrible thing happened, and Mother Mary took over guardianship of their children. So this way Mary Magdalene could try to save his life, and she did save his life. So when I go to a movie, whoever saves the good guy is known as the hero.
Yep.
So that means Mary Magdalene is the hero if she saved his life.
Yeah, the hero and also a teacher, a teacher whose teachings have been suppressed. It's supposedly in the Dead Sea Scrolls there is not supposedly, there are writings by Mary amongst the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Absolutely. I mean, she had the best education money could buy. She was from the richest family in that whole area.
That's the other myth, isn't it? That Jesus was poor, and actually the opposite was true. He was actually pretty wealthy, in order to be able to travel in the way that he did.
Well, he told me through Mimi that they weren't poor and they weren't rich.
Right.
That he wasn't poor and he wasn't rich. But once he connected with Mary Magdalene, because she came from such a wealthy family, and she used her family's influence and her connections from her dad's business that was all over the Middle East, she used that to help her husband, because that's what a wife does.
Mm-hmm.
That's what people do. You help your wife, you help your husband. And she had that ability, because of her father's influence, to help spread not only what he had learned, but what they both had learned. They were a team.
Right.
But one of the reasons why it was so unusual was because back then, women had hardly any rights at all.
And yet he had female disciples as well as male disciples.
Well, most of his disciples were female.
Yeah.
That's one of the things that he said to me through Mimi was that the way that, like, I've been doing all these events. I did my 462nd event last week in 5 years, and most of the people who come to my events are adult women. Mm-hmm. And that was, he said that was the same kind of following that he had back then also, because, he was a handsome man, and he had a beautiful message, and he was sharing spirituality in a very down-to-earth way. And the most important part of his message at the time related to the Temple of Jerusalem the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. And that's because the rabbis had convinced everybody that if you wanted to be with God, the only place God would appear to you was at the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, where the Wailing Wall is today. Okay. So if you lived in Nazareth or Magdala, where she was from, that's where her name, Mary of Magdala, Mary Magdalene, comes, because that's like the village right close to Nazareth. If you lived in that area, which was right next to the Sea of Galilee, it would take you 7 days walking across the desert to get to Jerusalem, to be with God. And that's what the rabbis had convinced everybody of. Well, when you learn meditation like Jesus and Mary Magdalene did, the first thing you learn is that you can connect with God, you can connect with spirit, and
Absolutely.
you can, that's spirituality 101.
Exactly. Everyone can have their own direct connection with God, their own direct communion and communication with God, and it doesn't require the intervention of a priest.
So that was the good news he was sharing with everybody. Hey, you don't have to walk for 7 days across the desert to be with God. Because God will appear to you wherever you are, because God is inside you and heaven is inside you. That's the most universal message you could possibly have. And that really upset the rabbis, because they had like the Jewish mafia going, where if you walk for 7 days to Jerusalem, you'd need a place to stay in Jerusalem.
Right.
So the rabbis were connected to the hotels, and you'd also need food to eat. So, you know, it was like a whole big giant business thing that they had going. And they didn't like the fact that Jesus was saying, you don't need them. You don't need the temple of Solomon to be with God, because God can appear to you wherever you are.
Yeah, wonderful. So on that note, we're going to take another break. Listeners, you're tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and my guest this evening, David Young. And we're talking about many things, but in particular, we're talking about his book, The True Story of Jesus and His Wife, Mary Magdalene. And I hope that we can continue this fascinating discussion in a few minutes after the ads have finished playing. Welcome back, listeners. You're tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie and with my guest, David Young. David is a musician, he's an artist, he's a channeler, he's a speaker, and he's a writer. And he's written a book about the true story of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. And that's what we were talking about before the break. And we were dipping into some facts and information about Jesus's life that are probably they're not accepted by the mainstream Christian community, but in more esoteric circles, many of us recognize that the story that's given to us in the Bible is truncated and selective. So maybe in the final segment of the show, David, it might be interesting to explore. So we've talked about Jesus and his life as it was then. What about the Jesus that appears to the people who come to your events, the Jesus that's available to anyone who, in service to the whole planet, basically? So maybe you can tell us a little bit about your personal experience with Jesus, and maybe some more stories about people at your events.
Sure. Well, first of all, people have to understand that it's not one way or no way. It's not Jesus or nothing. That's really, really ridiculous, because Jesus is totally buddies with Buddha and Krishna, Moses, and Mother Mary is total buddies with
Kuan Yin.
Kuan Yin and Mary Magdalene and Isis. You know, I call that the sisterhood of goddesses.
It's the divine feminine and the divine masculine, basically.
Absolutely. And one of the interesting things that Archangel Gabriel gave me as this information is that Kuan Yin had a husband, and her husband was a reincarnation of the divine masculine. Moses had a wife who was the reincarnation of the same divine feminine that Isis and Kuan Yin and Mother Mary was, you know. So the divine masculine and the divine feminine have interacted throughout history often.
Right.
Because, you know, that's how that works. As far as like the experiences that people have had at my events, it was so bizarre when Jesus started to appear to people at my events, because I come from a Jewish background. And it was, when you come from a Jewish background, there is never a reason to say Jesus' name in your house. Yeah. It doesn't happen. So it's really important to know that all of the ascended masters are all on the same team. They're not competing with each other the way it looks like in this physical world.
What a ridiculous notion, isn't it, really? You know, one really religion pitched against another.
And wouldn't it be amazing if Jewish people, and I grew up Jewish, if Jewish people realized that Moses was a reincarnation of Krishna, that Buddha was a reincarnation of Moses. It's the same divine masculine lineage. Now, one of the unique things that happens in this story is that when Jesus and Mary Magdalene incarnated in this life, it was their first lifetime. Jesus and Mary Magdalene started their own lineage, but Mother Mary had four sons besides Jesus and 3 daughters besides Jesus.
Yeah.
Okay. And 2 of Jesus's brothers were the reincarnation of Moses and his brother Aaron.
Mm-hmm.
And that reincarnation of Moses and his brother Aaron were also the reincarnation of Krishna and Arjuna, which is what the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu Bible, is about. Jesus had 2 brothers that were the reincarnation of Krishna and Arjuna, and at another time period, they were also a reincarnation of Moses and Aaron. So the kind of funny thing, you know, that saying that, you know, we search the world for light and wisdom, and it turns out being in his own backyard.
Yeah.
One of the reasons why Jesus went to India was to study the life of Krishna. And the reincarnation of Krishna was one of Jesus's brother. So
Mm-hmm.
that's what I mean by being in his own backyard, you know.
Are you familiar with the channeling of Edgar Cayce? Edgar Cayce, they've compiled a book of Edgar Cayce's channelings on the life of Jesus, and he says that Jesus had incarnations, about 30 or so incarnations before Jesus, and that one of them was Akhenaten, one of the pharaohs in Egypt.
Believe me, when this whole thing started unfolding with my book, there were certain things that they made ridiculously clear that they told me through different channelers, not only me. And one of them, it was his first lifetime on earth, and it was Mary Magdalene's first lifetime on earth. Okay. Akhenaten, who was Tutankhamun's father,
right,
and Ankhesenamun's father, Ankhesenamun and Tutankhamun, who was known as King Tut, they were brother and sister they were half brother, half sister who married. Akhenaten was their father.
Mm-hmm.
That Tutankhamun is of the same lineage of Moses and Buddha and Krishna. That's something you're not going to read in any book yet, because I haven't put that out in my next book. But I know 100% for sure that's his soul lineage, which would put Akhenaten in the same soul family, right? Because if Akhenaten is King Tut's father, right, he's in the same soul group, in the same soul family.
Mm-hmm. Well, interesting. And so what else can you tell us that would blow away our preconceived ideas of some of these things from the information that you are accessing?
Well, some of this information, there's some historical information that really helps put the puzzle together. I found out that there was a church in Mary Magdalene's name in the south of France called the Basilica of Saint Mary Magdalene.
Right.
And in America, there's so little known about Mary Magdalene. I thought that was incredible, unbelievable. How could there be a church in her name when most people only have one misconceived idea about who Mary Magdalene was? And, you know, that wouldn't be the kind of person who would have her own church, right? So it turns out that in the year 1279, and you guys can look this up online because it's in the history books. In the year 1279, a French nobleman was visited in a dream by Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene told this French nobleman that her bones were buried in a box under a church in a little village in the south of France called Saint Maximin. Mm-hmm. This experience was so powerful to this French nobleman, he brought a crew down to the south of France, found Saint Maximin, found the little church in the village, and went underneath the church and found a wooden box. And when he opened up that wooden box, there were bones inside the wooden box, human bones. In with those bones was a handwritten letter that said, "Here lie the bones of Saint Mary Magdalene." That French nobleman built a giant basilica on top of that little church, and they renamed the town in 1279 Saint Maximin le Saint Baume, and Baume means cave. Saint Maximin of the saint from the cave. Mary Magdalene was known as the saint from the cave because the cave of Mary Magdalene was close by to where the church was. where
Yeah.
they found her bones.
And there are stories of Mary Magdalene going to France with a daughter called Sarah. And actually, you said something earlier.
Let me clarify that.
Ask you about is that 3 children. So presumably one of them is Sarah. What are the
Hold on.
other 2?
Let me clarify that.
Yeah.
Jesus comes back when he's 30. He marries Mary Magdalene right away. Right. They have 3 children from the time he's 30 to 33.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. When the crucifixion happened and that whole mess happened, and Mary Magdalene had to make the hardest choice in the world. Does she stay with her 3 children and let her husband die?
Right.
Or does she try to save her husband's life and leave her 3 children with Mother Mary, which was her mother-in-law?
Right.
Well, she made the horribly difficult decision to leave her 3 kids with Mother Mary. And one of those children's name was Sarah, because in Aramaic, the name Sarah means princess. So you know how you would call your daughter a little princess?
Yeah.
You know, so that's why it was such a popular name. But all 3 of those kids were brought up by Mother Mary, and because they were only 1, 2, and 3 years old at the time, they didn't remember anything once they grew up of their childhood, because most people don't remember anything from when they're 1, 2, or 3 years old. Mary Magdalene saves Jesus' life. They eventually go 2,619 miles to this region of France called Digne-les-Bains, which is spelled Digne-les-Bains. And from there, they lived there for a while and then made their way south to this cave that's known as the Cave of Mary Magdalene. And they had their 4th child there that they named Sarah, because Sarah was like a little princess. That Sarah grew up and she lived to adulthood, and she had 3 children. So it is true what the Da Vinci Code says about Jesus and Mary Magdalene and their bloodline surviving after them in France.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really what happened. Regarding Sarah, they actually had 2 daughters named Sarah. The one in the original 3 kids they had, and then the 4th one they had once they got to France.
And so is your information, did he go into retirement and anonymity, or did he continue teaching and healing?
Oh, absolutely. He had to, I guess if you call it an early retirement, it wasn't what he wanted, but you have to remember, he had 2 scars on his hands and on his feet that showed that he was a criminal. The only people who had scars on their hands like that were people who were criminals, because the sign of a criminal was somebody who was crucified. That was public punishment. He wasn't the only person who had that happen to him. Thousands and thousands of people were publicly punished in what we know as a crucifixion. But once that happened, he had to live in hiding I don't want to say for the rest of his life, but for many, many, many years, until those scars healed up. And those scars did eventually heal up. So he didn't have the scars in his hand 20 years later, because they had healed up.
And is your information, did he remain in contact with any of the disciples or the apostles, the people who he trained, who were also, believing in the same and spreading the same message that he had?
No, he wasn't in contact. He never saw any of them again.
Wow.
And the whole reason why Christianity was created was because most of the people at that time were pagans. There was a small group of people who were Hebrews who believed in one God, but most of the people all over the world were pagans. And what pagans believed in, they believed in the sun and the moon, and they had goddesses for all different things.
Right.
And there was no one book or one mandatory belief system in the pagan religion, because as the Roman Empire expanded and they took over more and more countries, more and more cultures got absorbed into the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire didn't care what people believed in. They didn't care if you worshipped Isis or Horus or the sun, they didn't care about any of that stuff. Okay, so the pagans in North America, the Native Americans, they believed in a happy hunting grounds and an afterlife. Okay, And the Vikings and the Celts also believed in a Valhalla, which was an afterlife, right?
Right.
But the pagans in the Middle East did not believe in an afterlife. They just thought when you died, the TV set was turned off, everything went to zero, everything went black, and that was the end of it. So when Jesus's body went missing, he obviously couldn't walk anywhere because his feet were torn apart from that horrible thing. He was in such horrible shape because nobody ever lived through a crucifixion, because he was taken down off the cross after 6 hours because it was the eve of Passover. And the ancient Roman law stated that a Jewish person could not be tortured over a Jewish holiday. Okay, so that's why he was given a chance to live. That's the way the archangels had orchestrated this the way it had played out, for him to be taken down from the cross after 6 hours, so he'd at least have a chance to live, because nobody lived through that. And the pagans in the Middle East just figured, well, this guy couldn't walk anywhere. He was barely alive. He was in a coma. He wasn't going to walk anywhere. How could he survive? The pagans and the people, even his followers at the time, the only thing that made any sense was that his body disappeared and God took him up to heaven. That's only because they didn't know that Mary Magdalene had saved him and brought that wooden cart with the hay on it and the horse, and that's how he escaped. And so in the Bible, where it says that he appeared to the apostles and said, I'm going to prepare a place for you, he wasn't preparing anything for anybody. He was hanging on for his life. He was in a coma, having a near-death experience, and his suffering just began when he was taken down off the cross. Can you imagine trying to survive something like that without any anesthesia?
Or antibiotics.
Right. But Mary Magdalene, because she was a shaman and she had learned all of these healing things, you know, she was an herbalist. She kept him alive. And wow, the fact that he lived to be 72 years old meant that she took amazing care of him to survive 2 holes in his hand, 2 holes in his feet, and a hole in his rib.
Mm-hmm. Well,
there's one other thing that he had to survive also that I never thought of. I mean, most people, you'd never think about this, but what he had to survive was the fact that he felt completely betrayed by God and his spiritual guides. Because why did God allow that to happen to him? That's why in one of the things in the Bible that's true is where he says, Eli, why have you forsaken me? Because he's like, holy cow, I was doing everything I was being guided to do by spirit and by my spiritual guides. And then the next thing I know, I'm being tortured. Like, I thought you guys were going to protect me. And so forget what you read in the Bible about
that's
that.
because it's like, forgive them, Father, they know not what they do. I'm, the ultimate ascended master being tortured, and yet at the same time, forgive them, they don't know what they do.
That wasn't the big issue. The big issue was after the crucifixion, when he wakes up from being in a coma and he asks his wife, where are our children?
Wow.
And his wife has to say, your mother has the children. In order for us to escape, we couldn't handle having 3 kids on how could anybody handle that when she's trying to keep him alive and they have to be in hiding?
Yeah.
They knew he had 3 children, you know. He had to deal with the betrayal of thinking that God had betrayed him. That's a huge thing, to think that you've lost your kids and you've been tortured and it's going to take you years to heal from that.
Yeah.
And
it's interesting, isn't it? Because we don't think of it, people don't think of him as a human, and yet, he was human.
There's no doubt. That's part of the problem for him.
Yeah.
That's part of the problem, is that his story was hijacked and it became a story about somebody else. I mean, his name was never Jesus. Mm-hmm. You'll never, ever meet a Jewish person named Jesus. It's not a Jewish name. You're not allowed to call your child anything if it's not one of the Jewish names. Just like every religion has certain names that people are consistently named. Yeah. That whole story, I don't know if you know this, but the Egyptian god Horus, the eye of Horus, that symbol. Well, Horus's mother was Isis.
Yeah.
Okay. And Horus was supposedly born of a virgin birth.
Yes, I did know. Yeah.
When he was born, supposedly there were 3 wise men that appeared at his birth to his mother. There was a special star that appeared in the sky. That should sound very familiar.
Yep.
And Horus's birthday was celebrated for thousands of years before Jesus was ever even born. And Horus's birthday was celebrated on December 25th, all of those thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
What happened was that once Christianity became a growing thing and a bigger thing, they didn't want to call this holiday that everybody celebrated around the winter solstice called Horus's birthday. So they just changed the name of the holiday to a mass for Christ, which is where Christmas came from.
Yeah, and that wasn't really his birthday at all.
No, his birthday is April 6th.
Yeah, exactly. Well, you know what? Unfortunately, we're running out of time, David. This conversation could go on, and maybe we'll have you back on the show so that we can explore this some more. But for now, how can our listeners contact you and find out more about you? And if they want to attend any of your events, how do they go about that?
Sure. My website is davidyoungmusic.com. And all my books and all my CDs and everything is on there. The books are also available on Amazon. And the book, The True Story of Jesus and His Wife, Mary Magdalene, is available in a large paper book with, the book is 13 inches by 10 inches. And it comes with 12 QR codes that has 12 songs of my music included with the book. And 50 of my paintings are all part of the story, because I made all of these paintings I made all these paintings of these mountains and these caves, not knowing or realizing that I painted where they lived in that cave at the top of the mountain in the south of France.
Yeah, and we didn't even get into the artwork in this conversation. So yes, maybe we should have another chat.
Yeah, so the book comes as an audio book in English or Spanish. It also comes as an ebook in English or Spanish, and the paper book in English.
Yeah, wonderful. So that's davidyoungmusic.com. Yep. And all your events are on that website too?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you so much for being the guest on Unlocking Your Truth today, David. I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I wish you continued success is not the word, but continued expansion and sharing of your music and the experiences that you are helping people to have.
Thank you so much. Nice talking to you.
Likewise.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. All right, listeners, you've been tuning in to Unlocking Your Truth with Dr. Leslie, and we're here every Tuesday from 7 to 8 Pacific time on 101.7 FM.
Thank you for joining us. You've been listening to another Unlocking Your Truth podcast by Dr. Leslie Phillips. For more information, go to our website at drlesleyphillips.com. That's drlesleyphillips.com, where you can ask questions or send her an email, and there's many free gifts on there for you as well. You can also find the questions that were asked during this show at the website on our free card reading podcast page, where you'll find a full list of them. Come back again.